I'm sure that everyone who is a cartoon fan is aware of the massive TV show called SpongeBob SquarePants. The adventures and fun times of the anthropomorphic sea sponge and his underwater pals. I'm all too familiar with the show, as I grew up with the show ever since it first started airing right as the 90s were coming to their conclusion. The show has such an expansive history over its 20 plus years of airing on television, with stupendous highs like Bang Geeks and Chocolate with Nuts, to outrageous lows like Boating Buddies and One Course Meal. These episodes in particular were all the rave online, with critics and other fans of the show coming together to assassinate it at some point out of the serious number of flaws. I stopped watching the show before Season 7 aired due to one particular episode. This episode has kind of flown under the radar in comparison to episodes like House Fancy or The Splinter. I later discovered why that was. The version of the episode I watched was not only wildly distributed one. I had no idea how this version of this episode came to be, nor do I really want to know how it happened. All I can say is how I acquired this particular version of the episode. I was active on forums at the time when 4chan and Something Awful were in their prime. The year was 2009 and I was still a massive SpongeBob fan despite all the terrible episodes that were released. I was in the forum chat with some other people discussing about our experiences with the show, how we found the show, our favorite characters, etc. However, one thing a particular user said caught all of our attentions immediately. Do you want to see an unreleased episode of SpongeBob that'll be released sometime next month? Obviously, we were skeptical of this user. This had massive computer virus written all over it. Curiosity welled within me, however. If this were legitimate, I could spoil this to my family members, so I downloaded some antivirus software like Advest and continued messaging this user. I was an animator on SpongeBob hired to help things out when Steven Hillenburg had chosen to leave the show after the movie, the user began. I mainly contributed to Season 5 and Season 6 episodes. This particular episode was cut due to it being deemed too dark for the kids to watch, and the official episode that was released will be drastically lighter in tone. The user continued. I helped animate this particular episode before it was rewritten. I really enjoyed one part of the episode before those greedy snakes fired me. They act as if kids these days are as fragile as glass. Whatever happened to the days like Ren and Stimpy and Rocko's Modern Life? Those pussies couldn't handle a clown at a damn carnival, the user ranted. It appeared he had gotten to some kind of conflict or bitter moment with the company, as he had went on a total tirade about how shitty the business was and how they all cared about was safe distribution nonsense for the kids to gobble up, while their parents lit up cigars wishing they wore rubbers. This episode was secret for a variety of reasons. Those corporate slaves would never want this episode to be made public, the person explained. All I will say is that me and some others had a really fun time animating this, and I'm sure that'll be an episode you'll never forget. The user ended before he had sent me the link to the video and then went offline. This was all he offered me and was entitled Pineapple Fever. I thought it was an odd name, so I proceeded to download it to my computer. It was a .mp4 file, so it definitely did contain a video of some kind. Loading up my video playing software, I placed the MP4 folder in and waited for it to start. I was fairly certain that it would be a massive screamer or some kind of video to mess with me, but a shred of hope secretly wished it was real. The file had finished loading, and to my surprise, it was an actual SpongeBob SquarePants episode that was playing. It began with the iconic and well-beloved intro of SpongeBob SquarePants with the pirate portrayed singing the song. It continued with the porous yellow sponge playing his nose like a flute before it faded into the main title card. The title card itself was typical of a SpongeBob episode with nothing too out of the ordinary. It was a photo of SpongeBob's pineapple house, except it had a rusted chain secured tightly around it, with the padlock ensuing that it was locked. Above it read the title, Pineapple Fever. I thought this was maybe an episode where Patrick or maybe SpongeBob locked themselves within the house, and the story would be them trying to escape. And when the episode finally begun, it seemed that my theory was being proven correct. It began with both SpongeBob and Patrick sat on a sofa while watching the television. Patrick was messily eating some peanut butter and chocolate. His floral green shorts were now stained with peanut butter and chocolate sauce. SpongeBob was just sitting peacefully, minding his own business. It appeared that the two were watching some kind of special episode of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. "Oh boy, Patrick, this is the best part, turn it up!" SpongeBob excitedly said to his sea star friend as he moved in place. "Sure thing, SpongeBob," Patrick responded as he comedically pulled out a large speaker out of nowhere and hit a button to turn the thing on. I was shocked. The voices sounded almost exactly like the normal voice actors. However, I could tell that they really weren't the original ones. Squidward's voice was a little bit scratchier than usual, but I digress. The noise from the speaker was amplified to an almost cringe-inducing level, but of course, both SpongeBob and Patrick were oblivious to this as the two began cheering as Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy took down Man Ray. The camera then zoomed out to show Squidward, their grumpy next-door neighbor, sitting down on the sofa watching the news. He was supposed to be watching a new episode of his fancy show, but it got interrupted by a breaking news message. Squidward sighed at this, but simply continued watching. Breaking news, the news anchor Fish began. Bikini Bottom is experiencing all manners of a storm. This includes high rain. The fishes in the background then got drenched by water. Intense and strong winds. A nearby fish newspaper stand then got blown up and was carried away. And lastly, lightning. The news anchor Fish concluded before he was comedically struck by lightning. I won't drag on this, however. I'm sure that you all have seen the original episode of Pineapple Fever, as this has been over a decade since it was officially released, as of me writing this down, and this modified episode is mostly the same episode as in the original, so I'll continue only with the things that were noticeably different from the original episode. Instead of it being shown that the trio had been locked in SpongeBob's house for just one afternoon, we were instead treated to one of the signature title cards with the French narrator saying, "A few weeks later." Even without this title card, it was very clear that several weeks had passed since the storm began, as the time would clearly showcase within SpongeBob's pineapple residence. The walls of the abode were rotten and a sickly shade of orange. There were distinct lines throughout the building, indicating it reeked of a foul odor. Furniture was tossed around and smashed throughout the many rooms of the pineapple. Shattered glass and plates were littering the decrepit, destroyed kitchen. The fridge's door was ripped clean off, all the things resembling potential nourishment and hydration were picked clean. The worst part of it was, for sure, the characters. Squidward was huddled in a corner, eyes wide and bloodshot. He was skinny and frail looking. His entire body was slouched against a wall, while he was breathing heavily. His brown shirt was crumpled and torn in certain spots. A chunk of the fabric had been removed. His tentacles were bruised, and one was even a gross-looking shade of purple. He looked absolutely miserable. Even when Squidward was at his absolute worst, he never looked like this at all. He looked like as if he had been attacked by some kind of wild animal. SpongeBob was humming to himself while he sat in his armchair. His smart attire was practically in shambles. His sleeves were torn, his tie was missing in its entirety, his white shirt was stained with God knows what, while his shoes had giant holes in them exposing his feet. He looked just as tired as Squidward was. Frail and weak, the sponge appeared to be. Dry blood and tears were around his mouth. Upon the camera scrolling down, it showcased where the blood came from. The cracked and bruised, open shell of SpongeBob's beloved pet snail Gary was visible on his lap. It was obvious SpongeBob had killed and cannibalized his loyal pet. The tears were most likely from guilt that SpongeBob was feeling over being forced to eat his friend. My mouth became agape at what I was seeing. I wasn't going to cry or never watch SpongeBob ever again like you would think. I was just in shock at the animation. It definitely looked professionally done. The blood was drawn so perfectly that it would fit into SpongeBob's universe almost seamlessly. The blood was cartoony and it was detailed. Why would someone animate this? I get holding a grudge against a company and all, but what if it was a little kid stumbled across this episode online? That would be one ruined childhood for sure. However, the worst one was definitely Patrick. His floor patterns trunks were stained so much that the patterns of the trunks weren't even visible anymore. His mouth was stained with all kinds of things that I couldn't even decipher. He had an extended belly. No doubt Patrick had been drained all of the series' dwindling food supplies. He was laughing to himself, coiled into a ball in the corner of the room. No doubt all of them were slowly going insane, and it was inevitable the conflict would happen at some point in time. And it turns out that's exactly what happened. It cut away from the overweight sea star and back to SpongeBob, who was weakly pulling himself up to his feet. The sponge then proceeded upstairs to his room and sat down quietly on the disheveled bed, while seeing as if the storm had dissipated, which the sponge's sadness had not disappeared. He sighed near a loud rumbling sound that indicated someone was hungry. It panned over to show that Patrick was the cause of all of this. He spoke out in a tired and lazy voice. "Squidward, where's all the food?" "Patrick, you ate all of it!" Squidward snapped back. In truth, he was tired of dealing with the fat oaf of a sea star. Throughout his life, he had done nothing but harass, bully, hurt, beat, and torture him, and he was not in the mood to be dealing with them. "Squidward, you had the last pack of snail food. It was clearly you who was hogging it all," Patrick responded back in an offended tone. While the camera panned to show the showcase of his extended belly, the starkly contrasted between SpongeBob and Squidward, who were all frail and malnourished. This, however, was the tipping point. Decades of misery, crushed dreams, and pain all bottled up within the octopus's mind. He had held back everything in some feeble attempts to try and get through Patrick and SpongeBob, but that one statement was like the floodgates of hell opening. Squidward screamed in the most anger-filled way that I had ever seen in a cartoon character scream. His face was red and pulsating with veins all over, indicating the octopus had finally had enough. He jumped forward and seized Patrick by the throat, pinning the gluttonous pink starfish to the wall with extreme force. Patrick instantly began gagging and choking in response. He followed his chubby pink arms in an attempt to try and break free from his grip. Squidward held firm and even began slapping the sea star repeatedly. SpongeBob's eyes became wide at this and immediately began trying to pull Squidward off Patrick. Eventually, Patrick broke free by biting down hard on Squidward's hand, causing the octopus to yell and drop him. "Squidward, stop it! Patrick didn't eat it all! We all had some!" SpongeBob yelled out to try and stop the octopus from hurting Patrick anymore. "Well, SpongeBob, you clearly had more than me. You can yell while I can barely fit a spoon," Patrick said ungratefully as he soon held the spoon weakly before dropping it with exaggeration. "I ate more. Patrick, look at you. You're tubby," SpongeBob yelled while pointing at Patrick's stomach. The hunger had finally gotten to SpongeBob. The nice fry cook with a heart of gold was gone. In his place was a desperate being, craving food with no sense of friendship. He realized in the split second that Patrick was always to blame for their food situations. He had eaten all of SpongeBob's frozen food in one swoop, instead of rationing it like he and Squidward did. He really was a fat, bumbling idiot. Patrick growled loudly in pure rage. "Nobody calls me Tubby!" Patrick bellowed as he pounced onto SpongeBob. Patrick began biting down hard into SpongeBob's arm. There was no blood that came out of it, but rather yellow chunks flew out of the floor. SpongeBob fought back by kicking him hard, causing the starfish to fall back and bang his head on a nearby shelf. Squidward simply backed away into a corner, afraid for his life and the deterioration of SpongeBob and Patrick's mental state. SpongeBob ran to the kitchen and took out a knife. He held it close to his eye as his eye began twitching over and over. Patrick had taken a far more primitive approach. He broke off one of the legs on a nearby table and held it like a sword, and the sharp end pointing away. SpongeBob walked away slowly around the messed up pineapple. So many beautiful memories were born in this place. After seeing it all broken and destroyed, it was finally cause for this lovable sponge to snap. Patrick eventually caught sight of SpongeBob in the kitchen. He immediately began making a dash towards SpongeBob. The extra food the starfish contributed to his speed in the manner. SpongeBob turned around and saw Patrick flying in the air towards him. As Patrick jumped high into the air, a loud slash sound was heard, then nothing but silence. Squidward finally stopped trembling in the corner as he noticed the lack of volume in the decrepit, decaying pineapple. He rounded the corner of the kitchen. The camera zoomed in on his face. All anger was gone from his face. Instead, an expression of pure shock and sadness was placed on his face. Patrick was unmoving on top of SpongeBob. A kitchen knife was planted deep within his head. There was also no blood from Patrick, but rather the knife was just stuck blocking any kind of bodily fluids from exiting via the hole. SpongeBob, however, wasn't unmoving. He was groaning in pain. Patrick had caught him in the chest. His legs were crushed due to Patrick's enormous weight and because of SpongeBob's malnourishment. Squidward had finally came back to Earth as he tried to pull Patrick's body off from SpongeBob. After a good 30 seconds, Squidward was successful, as Patrick's form laid lifeless on the other side. Squidward had his arm wrapped around SpongeBob's shoulder as a way of supporting him as he attempted to get the fry cook back onto his feet, but inevitably a loud crack sounded as SpongeBob dropped to the floor, his legs useless and damaged beyond repair. He could barely move. His breathing was slowly faltering. His eyes were barely open, and his time was almost up. Squidward was too much in shock to speak. He tried uttering some form of words of an apology, but SpongeBob weakly reached his hand up and shushed him. It was clear to Squidward in that moment that SpongeBob was never the annoying, absorbent bother that he always knew. He was a pure and nice bikini bottomite. Eventually, SpongeBob closed his eyes, his arm fell limp, and he breathed no more. SpongeBob was gone. Squidward began sobbing as hard as he could and tried shaking SpongeBob in some attempt to get him to respond, but Sponge's body remained still. Squidward laid down beside the two bodies, curled up in a fetal position, and cried and cried and cried. The episode ended with a slow zoom out, as Squidward's crying grew more and more quieter, before the episode faded to black. I closed down the video link and just remained motionless in my chair. I wasn't freaked out, nor would I ever browse the internet again. I was just shocked. What the hell did I just watch? Well, one thing was for certain, the creator was right on the money when it came to this episode. It has now been a few years since the individual contacted me. He vanished shortly after sending me the link. The working theory was that he got in trouble with Viacom, but we'll never really know for sure. I have always had a fascination with episodes that were cancelled or were altered before this release. I wanted an episode that was like no other, and I got it. I guess what they say is true. Be careful what you wish for, you might just get it. But if you do, you might not get it in the way you might want it.
In fear and surprise, as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each bated breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping, horror-driven, nightmarish, gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online now. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because you're